Yesterday, I buried my wife alone. The man who should have stood beside me, our son, was too busy blowing out candles with his wife on her birthday. Today, that same son came to me with a request, his voice casual, his eyes full of expectation, as though nothing had happened. He thought I would fold, that a father's love was still his safety net. I gave him exactly what he had earned. One last step, final, permanent. A step that shook his world harder than any grave ever could. Before we dive in, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. My wife, Rachel, loved October. The way the leaves turned 100 shades of orange and brown, the crisp air that smelled of wood smoke and coming frost. She always said it was a kind of a gentle goodbye. We buried her on a clear, cool Tuesday afternoon, under a sky she adored, so pale it looked like frosted glass. The air was still, heavy with the cloying scent of lilies and freshly turned earth. The only sounds were the minister's droning eulogy, the distant hum of a highway, and the miserable scuffing of my own shoes on the damp grass. I stood alone beside her casket, a solitary figure in a sea of empty space, watching it lower into the earth. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the groan of the ropes and the soft, final thud of the casket settling. The sun, a pale yellow disk, offered no warmth, and a cold breeze cut through my thin suit, the wool scratching my neck. The physical ache was a cruel echo of the hollow one in my chest. He should be here. The thought was not just about her absence, but about his. It should have been our son, Ethan, standing with me, but he wasn't there. Anya, his wife, had sent a brief, impersonal text that morning about an unavoidable obligation. I knew it was a lie. A neighbor later showed me a picture on social media. The screen glowed unnaturally bright in the dim afternoon, their smiling faces illuminated by birthday candles on a large chocolate cake. They were blowing out wishes while my world had been extinguished. That was the last memory I had of my son's love before he came to my door. He showed up the next day, his arrival punctuated by the clinical click of his leather soles on the hardwood floor. He was right on time, as if it were a business appointment. His shoes were too new, his suit too shiny, and he wore the confident grin of a man who'd just closed a big deal. Anya was with him, clutching a fancy purse, her expression a mask of forced sympathy, her impatience betrayed by a subtle glance at her watch. It felt rehearsed, a performance for which they were awaiting my cue. He walked into the living room, a space thick with Rachel's absence, and sat in the armchair she always used. A sacrilege. The worn floral fabric, which still held the faint scent of her lavender perfume, seemed to protest under his weight. My grief was a physical pressure, a dull ache behind my sternum, but I pushed it down, replacing it with a cold, clear clarity. "Dad," he said, his voice casual, a sound I had once loved. "I'm so sorry about Mom. She was a wonderful person." The words were empty, a required greeting before the main event. It wasn't a condolence. It was a preface. He went on, his hands making sweeping, theatrical gestures as he spoke of a new business venture. He called it Apex Innovations, a company focused on what he vaguely described as digital solutions for modern life. It was, he said, with a practiced, almost breathless excitement, a groundbreaking tech startup that would change everything, and it would be worth a fortune. He just needed a little capital to get it off the ground, he explained with an unnerving ease. A lot of capital, actually. He paused for effect before delivering the number. A cool $1 million. The request was framed as a casual family investment, an opportunity I would be foolish to pass up. The business was just a few buzzwords, a vague description of disruptive technology that he clearly didn't understand. I watched Anya as he spoke. She nodded along, but her eyes were darting around the room, cataloging the silver on the mantelpiece, assessing, calculating. The way she looked at the photos of Rachel was not with sadness, but with the quiet indifference of a stranger in a museum. It was a moment of true, chilling realization. He hadn't just forgotten his mother. He had been coached to forget. This wasn't a son's lapse in judgment, for this was a calculated, cold-blooded transaction. My love had become a commodity, a resource to be exploited, and my grief, an inconvenience to be navigated. I stood, the movement slow and deliberate, and walked to my desk. My fingers traced the grain of the cool, solid oak that had belonged to my father. My eyes fell on a photograph of an old college friend, Marcus, a financial advisor who had helped me navigate the messy aftermath of my own father's death. A cold certainty settled in my gut, and a plan took shape. This was not a request. This was a test, and they were failing it with every passing second. I turned back to Ethan, my voice steady now, stripped of grief. $1 million is a lot of money, son. It was not the voice of a mourning father, but of a man about to take a stand. He thought I would fold, that a father's love was still his safety net. He leaned forward, sensing victory, his lips curling into a smug smile. "It's a risk, Dad, but it's a big payoff," he said, his voice full of smug confidence. I walked past him and stood at the window, my back to them. The sky bled into bruised purples and fiery oranges, colors Rachel would have loved. A bittersweet reminder of everything I had lost. In a nearby closet, an old laptop of Rachel's sat on a shelf. I remembered her telling me once that she always kept a physical backup of her most important files on a hard drive, a small black square she kept in her desk drawer. This is my moment. My son preferred his wife's birthday to his mother's funeral, I said, my voice low. The very next day he came to me with a request. But I took one last step, final, permanent. The air in the room grew tight, charged. I turned back, my eyes locking with his. "I'll give you everything you need, son. All I need is to see the books. Every single account, all of it." The smile vanished from his face. His posture stiffened, the easy confidence draining away, replaced by a flicker of wary confusion. He knew he couldn't refuse, but he didn't know what he had just agreed to. He didn't know that my one last step would be the first step in his downfall. The flash drive Ethan handed me felt weightless and slick in my palm, a cheap piece of plastic that perfectly represented the hollowness of his gesture. Its surface was too smooth, too sterile. It was an act of empty compliance, meant to soothe a man he believed was too blinded by grief to see the truth. I drove back to the house, the steering wheel slick and cold beneath my white-knuckled grip. The car's interior smelled of stale air and the faint, lingering scent of Rachel's citrus perfume, a ghost on the upholstery. Outside, the passing autumn scenery was a somber blur of liquid gold and blood crimson against a steel-gray sky that promised a cold rain. The silence in the car was a physical pressure, broken only by the whisper of tires on asphalt, a stark contrast to the hurricane churning in my head. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint, dusty scent of a house left to its own quiet devices. I didn't turn on the main lights, preferring the encroaching twilight. I plugged the drive into my old desktop in the study, and the tower whirred to life with a familiar, rattling groan, the fan kicking up the smell of warm electronics. The monitor cast a cold blue light across my face and the mahogany desk, illuminating a landscape of neatly organized files with aggressively businesslike names. Financials, investor deck, projections. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, a glossy facade designed to pass the most cursory inspection. The numbers, though, were a work of brazen fiction. I could see it instantly, the revenue of fantasy born from creative accounting, and the expenses ludicrously inflated to create the illusion of a struggling but legitimate enterprise. The whole venture was a house of cards. My grief was still a raw, open wound, but a new sensation was crystallizing within it, a focused, cold fury that flowed through my veins like ice, giving me a purpose I hadn't known I needed. I would not let them get away with this. The house was a quiet museum of my life with Rachel. Her presence was not a ghost, but an imprint on everything. I felt it in the worn softness of the velvet armchair where she read, and I could almost smell the dark roast coffee she'd hummed over at the stove each morning. It was in the back of a dim hall closet, the air thick with the scent of cedar and old paper, that I found it, tucked away on a high shelf behind a stack of photo albums. Her old laptop. It was a small, unassuming machine, its aluminum case cool to the touch and marked with a faint scratch near the faded Apple logo. I pulled it down, a fine layer of dust coating my fingertips like gray silk, and sat with it at the kitchen table, the place where we had shared thousands of quiet moments over chipped ceramic mugs. The screen flickered to life with a soft hum. The old operating system a strange, pixelated comfort from a simpler time. It was password protected. My heart sank as I began the frustrating ritual of guesses, the scent of lemon polish from the table rising faintly around me. Her birthday failed, then mine followed in useless succession. I typed the dog's name, then her own maiden name, my frustration growing with each soft, unsatisfying click of the keys and each dismissive shake of the password box. Think, what would she have used? I was about to give up, my shoulders slumping in defeat, when I remembered an old joke between us, a silly phrase from a movie we both loved. I typed the combination of her birth date and the year we met, the year she always said her life had restarted. With a quiet, welcoming chime, the desktop materialized, and the files unlocked. A flood of memories washed over me as I scrolled through the folders, the trackpad clicking softly beneath my trembling finger in the silent kitchen. There were old emails filled with her sharp wit, and countless family photos that made my chest ache, but one folder stood out, marked simply, Ethan and Anya. Clicking on it felt like a profound transgression, a violation of her privacy, yet I knew with absolute certainty that this was what she would have wanted. It was a treasure trove of documents Rachel had been quietly, meticulously collecting for months. Bank statements downloaded as PDFs, screenshots of cryptic transfers, and notes she had typed to herself. She had noticed the same strange transactions that I had, long before I ever did. A deep, aching regret hit me like a physical blow, tightening my chest until it was hard to breathe. She had been worried, carrying this heavy burden alone, her secret investigation a testament to her unwavering, protective love for a son who was drifting away. The documents she had compiled were far more detailed than the fraudulent files Ethan had given me. There were account numbers, dates, and amounts, a series of digital breadcrumbs she had been following, trying to build a case not to condemn our son, but perhaps to save him from himself. I began printing her files, the old inkjet printer in the study whirring and spitting out pages with a rhythmic, mechanical sound that filled the quiet house. The smell of warm ink and paper became a tangible presence. I spread the documents across the broad, polished surface of the dining room table, turning it into a command center. On one side lay Ethan's glossy, fictitious projections, the paper slick and professional. On the other, Rachel's stark, factual evidence, printed on simple copy paper that felt honest in its plainness. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved between shell corporations with innocuous names like Apex Holdings, and Global Ventures, a complex web of deceit designed to confuse and mislead. It was a classic, albeit sophisticated, money laundering scheme. I suddenly pictured Anya's face as she'd offered her shallow condolences last week, the flicker of triumph in her eyes as she surveyed our home. She was the architect of this. Buried in a subfolder named Correspondence, I found a series of emails between Rachel and a familiar name, Marcus Thorne, my old college friend, the financial advisor. A spark of genuine hope cut through the gloom. He had told me once, over a glass of expensive whiskey, that numbers never lie, and people only lie to hide what the numbers already know. He would understand this. I reached for my phone, my hand steady for the first time in days. I spent hours cross-referencing everything, my eyes scanning the documents under the single, intense cone of light from the table lamp as the sun set and the house fell into deep shadow. The only sounds were the rustle of paper and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Then I found it. A wire transfer confirmation for a massive, unexplained sum from a holding company in the Cayman Islands. It was the keystone, the single transaction with no corresponding invoice or business purpose in Ethan's doctored books. The paper felt different in my hand, heavier. It was a loose thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything. The next few hours were a blur of focused activity. Fueled by stale coffee that tasted like ash, I organized every piece of evidence, Rachel's meticulous files and Ethan's arrogant lies, onto a single new flash drive. This file was not a request for money. It was an indictment. The anonymous Cayman Islands transfer was the heart of it, a transaction that existed only to wash dirty money clean. It was the hard, irrefutable proof I needed, the first permanent step I would take to bring their entire corrupt world crashing down around them. The silence between us was now a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that settled over our family. My son, Ethan, and his wife, Anya, were no longer just my family. They were two actors in a play, their every move calculated, their every word a lie. My simple request for transparency had transformed me from a grieving father into a silent antagonist, a man they were now actively trying to avoid. I could see the shift in their body language, the way they would hold their breath when I came into a room. When I called Ethan to ask for more paperwork, he would brush me off with vague excuses. "We're still getting things together," he'd say, his voice a low, hostile growl. "It's a huge project." His voice was full of a veiled impatience, a clear boundary being drawn between us. The more I pushed, the more he pulled away, a tangible withdrawal that hurt more than any sharp word. He was not just distancing himself. He was erasing me from his life. Anya was even more evasive. Her phone would ring, and she'd leave the room to take the call, her voice a hushed whisper. She would clutch her purse a little closer, her eyes scanning the room as if she was expecting someone to be watching her. She was a woman constantly trying to maintain an illusion. I saw her in the kitchen one morning, her back to me, her hand shaking as she spoke into the phone. She was speaking in a hushed, nervous whisper. "He's asking too many questions," she said, her voice a low, panicked sound. "He's going to mess everything up." The words were like a physical blow. It was the moment I realized that she was not just an accomplice. She was a co-conspirator. The fear in her eyes was a revelation, a clear sign that I was getting close to the truth. She was the one pulling the strings, the one with the plan, the one who was truly a danger to my family. I couldn't give them any more time. This was my last chance to make them pay for what they had done. I had to act now. This was one last step. The next day, I went to his office. It was a small, nondescript building on a quiet street, a perfect cover for their illegal operations. The office was sparse, a few desks, some computers, a couple of people staring at their screens. Ethan looked surprised to see me, his face a mask of anger and fear. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and hostile. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice calm, my resolve clear. He led me into his office, a small room with a large, empty desk. The only things on the desk were a few files and a brand-new laptop. I noticed a small photograph on his desk, a picture of him and Anya laughing. He saw me looking at it and quickly covered it with a file. I could feel his nervousness, the way his hands shook as he sat down. I told him that I needed to see more documents, more evidence of the company's success. He tried to brush me off again, but I stood my ground. "I'm not leaving until I see what I came for," I said. He finally relented, giving me a flash drive with some more files. I took it, and as I walked out, I saw Anya in the hallway. Her face, a mask of forced politeness, had now cracked. I saw a flicker of something new in her eyes. It was a look of pure hatred, a look that said she knew what I was doing, and she was going to make me pay for it. I knew then that there was no going back. The lines had been drawn. The game had begun. As I drove home, I plugged the flash drive into my computer. The files were more of the same, more vague documents, more forged signatures. It was a dead end. But I had one more trick up my sleeve. I had a copy of the key to his office, a small gift he had given me when he first moved in. I also had a memory of a document he had mentioned on the phone that he hadn't given me, a document he had called the master file. I remembered his mention of a lockbox in the office, a safe he kept his most important documents in. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. I had to find that box. I had to find the truth. I knew it would be dangerous, but I was willing to take the risk. I was willing to go to any length to expose him. I was willing to sacrifice everything, even my own safety, for a chance at justice. I went back that night, under the cover of darkness. The office building was empty, the lights off. I used the key he had given me to let myself in. The building was a maze of dark hallways and empty offices. I found his office and went in. The lockbox was hidden under a false floor panel, just as he had said. I used a small crowbar to pry it open. Inside, I found a stack of cash, a passport, and a small notebook. I opened the notebook. It was full of numbers, names, and dates, a detailed record of every transaction. It was the master file, the one he had tried to keep from me. It was everything I needed to bring them down. The master file was a document of pure evil, a document that detailed every lie, every deception, every transaction. It was a document that would expose them, a document that would bring them down. I took it and left, a cold, hard satisfaction settling in my chest. I knew that I had everything I needed to bring them down. The master file was my weapon. It was my final, permanent step. It was the one that would shake his world harder than any grave ever could. It was my last step. The phone call was a brief, tense affair. "Dinner tonight," I said. No pleasantries, no small talk, just a directive. I didn't give them a choice. I found the master file. I had the truth. They agreed. They had to. The dinner was at a small, elegant restaurant downtown, the kind of place where hushed conversations and the soft clinking of silverware were the only sounds. The lighting was low and warm, the walls lined with black and white photographs of old Hollywood stars. It was a world of quiet sophistication, a stark contrast to the storm I was about to unleash. They arrived a few minutes late, both dressed in what they clearly considered their best. Ethan in a dark, expensive suit, Anya in a designer dress that cost more than Rachel's entire wardrobe. They looked like a couple from a magazine, a perfect picture of modern success. I, in my simple tweed jacket, felt a world away from them. I was a man of the earth, and they were people of the clouds, People who had forgotten what it felt like to have their feet on the ground. They sat down, their faces a carefully constructed mask of politeness. They wanted to know if I had made a decision about their proposal. "I'm still looking at the numbers," I said calmly. "But I have some questions." I pulled out a small folder, not the one with the real evidence, but a decoy. It contained some of the documents he had given me, with a few notes I had made in the margins. The documents were a flimsy defense, and I knew it. The real evidence was a notebook full of numbers and dates, a notebook that was in my safe at home. The decoy was just a prop, a tool to make them squirm. Anya's eyes darted to the folder, a flicker of fear in her gaze. She was a woman who was always on guard, a woman who had spent her life hiding a secret. She was a woman who was about to be exposed. I started with a simple question. "What's the source of this $500,000? I asked, pointing to a line on one of the documents. "It's a seed investment," Ethan said quickly, his voice a little too loud. "A friend of mine." He didn't give a name. I asked about the other large transactions. They gave me a series of vague, evasive answers. Their voices were getting louder now, their faces flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You're questioning us?" Anya said, her voice full of indignation. I just smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that made her flinch. "I'm asking questions. It's what a responsible investor does." The dinner became a public interrogation. I didn't raise my voice. I just kept asking. My questions were simple, but they were precise, and they exposed every lie. I used their own documents against them, pointing out the inconsistencies, the forged signatures, the ghost companies. I saw the look of panic in their eyes as they realized they couldn't keep up with the story. They began to argue with each other, their whispers becoming louder and more frantic, their carefully constructed facade crumbling. The other diners were starting to notice. The quiet hum of conversation had ceased, replaced by the soft rustle of curious glances. They were looking at our table, their faces full of curiosity, their whispers a low buzz. Ethan and Anya were losing control. They were no longer a picture of success. They were a spectacle, a public disgrace. I just sat back and watched, a silent observer of their unraveling. I didn't need to do much. The truth was speaking for itself. I took a sip of my water, a little smile playing on my lips. They were getting angry. They were getting desperate. I was enjoying every moment of it. I had given them everything they needed to incriminate themselves, and they were taking the bait. I saw the way their eyes would dart to the exit, the way their hands would shake as they tried to explain themselves. This was the poetic justice I had been dreaming of. It was sweet, and it was cold. "This is ridiculous," Ethan said finally, his voice a low growl. "How could you do this to your own family?" He pushed his chair back, the sound echoing through the quiet restaurant. "You're treating us like criminals." He was no longer trying to hide his anger. He was letting it all out, a raw, ugly rage that was a reflection of the man he had become. His face was red, his fists clenched, his body shaking with a barely controlled rage. I just sat there, my expression unchanged. "I'm just asking questions," I said softly. He stormed out of the restaurant, Anya following close behind him, her face a mask of shame and defeat. I sat there for a long time, finishing my dinner. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I just felt a quiet, cold satisfaction. I had given them the rope to hang themselves with. All I had to do now was wait for the right time to pull the chair out from under them. I knew that this was just the beginning. The public humiliation at the dinner was a powerful tool, a powerful warning, but it was not the end. The real reckoning was yet to come. The notebook I had found in his office, the master file, contained all the evidence I needed to bring them down. The next few weeks were a blur. I met with a man I knew from my past, a financial advisor who had always been a step ahead of the rest. I showed him the notebook, the numbers, the dates, the transactions. He was quiet for a long time, his eyes scanning the pages. He had seen it all before. He had seen the greed, the lies, the deceit. He had seen it all. I told him about the public humiliation at the dinner, the way their facade had crumbled, the way they had exposed themselves. He just nodded. He understood. This wasn't about money. This was about justice. This was about revenge. This was about putting things right. The final act was yet to be played. The climax was yet to come. I knew what I had to do. I had to attend their public launch party, the one they were throwing to celebrate their success. I had to use this public stage to expose them, to destroy their reputation, to destroy their lives. It was my last step. It was my final step. It was the step that would shake their world harder than any grave ever could. It was my final step. The aftermath of our dinner left a lingering silence in the house, a stark and deliberate void where family conversations used to be. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound Rachel had found comforting, now seemed to count down the seconds of my isolation. Ethan and Anya had gone quiet, believing they had won, that they had called my bluff. I spent the next few days in quiet preparation, the rustle of paper under my desk lamp the only sound late into the night. The master file, a compilation of their deceit, was a heavy secret that I could feel in my mind, and as a physical weight in the cold steel of my safe at home. I went to the bank, the air inside sterile and smelling of processed paper, and withdrew a large sum of money. The crisp bills felt strangely sharp in my hands, a final act of severing a financial cord I never imagined would be cut. This was war, and I was not a man to be trifled with. I called my old friend Marcus, the financial advisor. We met for lunch at a small cafe tucked away on a side street, a quiet place where the rich aroma of coffee mingled with the scent of old wood, and the low murmur of other patrons provided a cloak of anonymity. I laid out the files from Rachel's laptop across the small table. He didn't need me to say anything. The numbers spoke for themselves, and he traced a column of figures with a single, knowing finger. "This is a classic shell game," he said quietly, his voice a calm anchor in my storm. "They're routing money through a series of ghost companies to clean it." He was talking about money laundering. On a napkin, he took a pen and sketched a quick, sharp diagram of arrows and boxes, a chaotic web showing the convoluted path the funds took. It was an elaborate scheme, but Marcus had seen it all before. He had helped me with my father's will, and his steady presence was an invaluable comfort now. He leaned forward, his own lunch forgotten, his eyes full of a deep, quiet concern. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to give them a taste of their own medicine," I said, my hand tightening around my warm coffee mug. I told him about the launch party Ethan and Anya were throwing to celebrate their supposed success. "I need you to be there with me," I said. "I need you to be my witness." He held my gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, firm nod. It was more than agreement. It was a silent pact. He understood. This was not about money. This was about justice for Rachel's memory. This was my one last step. The party was held at a lavish, exclusive venue downtown, the kind of place with ceilings so high you felt small and insignificant. The air was oppressively warm and thick with a dozen competing expensive perfumes, while the bass from the speakers vibrated up through the polished marble floor. A massive crystal chandelier fractured the light, creating a dizzying, unreal atmosphere. The room was packed with the city's most influential people, their forced laughter brittle and loud, all celebrating the success of a company that was nothing but a mirage. Ethan and Anya stood in the middle of it all, a king and queen in their court of lies. He wore a tailored suit that screamed of unearned confidence, and she wore a shimmering silk dress, holding her champagne flute like a scepter. When their eyes found me near the entrance, their smiles faltered. I saw a brief, imperceptible flicker of shock, then fear, cross their faces before the social masks snapped back into place. They thought I had come to capitulate. They were wrong. Anya glided toward me, her approach parting the crowd, the silk of her dress whispering against the air. Her cloying perfume arrived before she did. "Dad, I'm so glad you came," she said, her voice a sickeningly sweet honey meant to disguise the poison underneath. "We missed you." Her eyes darted around the room, a silent plea for me to play along. "I wouldn't have missed this for the world," I replied, my voice even. I held up the small, cold flash drive in my hand, a tiny object that felt impossibly heavy with destructive power. Her eyes locked onto it, and she knew instantly what it was. The color drained from her face, her perfectly manicured hand fluttering to her diamond necklace in a gesture of unconscious panic. Ethan was beside her in a second, his face a storm of anger and fear. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice a low growl lost in the music. "I came to make a toast," I said. I didn't wait for a microphone. I walked straight to the stage, the heat of the stage lights warm on my face, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest. I felt no sorrow, only a profound and quiet satisfaction as I spoke of my wife, Rachel, and the fact that my son skipped her funeral to celebrate his wife's birthday, only to come to me with a request the very next day. The music cut off with an abrupt scratch, leaving a ringing in the heavy, expectant void. All eyes were on me. I held up the flash drive. I gave him exactly what he had earned. One last step. Final. Permanent. The words hung in the air, an indictment and a promise of reckoning. My voice grew loud and clear, echoing through the cavernous room as I laid out the simple, damning facts. I spoke of the $2 million they had requested to build their world-changing company. And then I spoke of the forged documents, the shell corporations at false addresses, and the names of people who didn't exist. I spoke of the bank account I had found, filled with anonymous transfers from illicit sources. I had all the evidence on that flash drive, a story of greed, betrayal, and deceit. It was a public humiliation, a spectacle of their own making. I saw the pure panic on Anya's face as her eyes darted toward the door. The people in the room were not strangers. They were their friends, their business partners, their investors. A low murmur started, a hiss like escaping steam that grew into a churning sea of whispers. Phones came out, faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of their screens. As the ruin began to spread digitally, they were looking at Ethan and Anya not with pity, but with disgust, judging and condemning them as the con artists they were. It was the cold, sweet, poetic justice I had been dreaming of. It was my final step. The whispers grew louder. Ethan and Anya tried to leave, but the crowd shifted. Not aggressively, but in a way that closed off the exits, creating a wall of judgment. They were trapped in a cage of their own making. The launch party, intended as a celebration of their success, was now a public reckoning. It was the most satisfying moment of my life. I had given them a public lesson in consequences, a humiliation that would be a permanent stain on their reputation, a wound that would never heal. As they finally managed to push their way to the door, a path cleared for them as if they were lepers, the sound of Anya's heels on the marble floor unnaturally loud. She turned back, her face half in shadow, her eyes glinting with pure malice. "You think you won?" she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss that cut through the noise, meant only for me. "I took your boy from you long before he stopped going to funerals." The room went silent, a sudden and profound stillness that was more deafening than any sound. The music had stopped, the hum of conversations had died down, replaced by 100 pairs of eyes staring at me, at the small flash drive in my hand, at my son and his wife who stood frozen in the center of the room. The air, which had been thick with the scent of expensive perfume and success, now felt cold and thin, like the air of a tomb. The stage, which had been set for a celebration, was now a public gallows. The flash drive felt like a loaded weapon in my hand, a weapon that was not meant to kill, but to expose. I saw the look of pure terror on Ethan's face, a look that said he knew he was about to be destroyed. I saw the rage on Anya's face, a rage that said she knew she had been defeated. I was a man of the earth, a man who had his feet on the ground, and they were people of the clouds, and their world was about to come crashing down. I didn't need a microphone. I didn't need a stage. My voice, low and clear, carried through the silent room, a voice that was not of a grieving father, but of a man who was about to deliver a verdict. I didn't get into legal terms. I didn't talk about fraud or money laundering. I just laid out the simple, damning facts. I spoke of the $2 million they had requested from me, a sum they claimed would be used to build a company that would change the world. I spoke of the forged documents, the shell corporations, the false addresses, the names of people who didn't exist. I spoke of the bank account I had found, the one with the anonymous transfers. I had all the evidence right there on that flash drive, a collection of documents and files that told a story of greed, betrayal, and deceit. The story was a public humiliation. It was a spectacle of their own making. I saw the look on Anya's face, the way her eyes darted to the door, a look of pure panic. She knew what I was doing. She knew what was coming. The people in the room were not just a bunch of strangers. They were friends, business partners, colleagues, and family members. They were all people who had been lied to. They were all people who had been betrayed. The realization was a painful one. The whispers started, a soft rustle of sound that grew louder and louder. They were looking at Ethan and Anya with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were judging them. They were condemning them. They were seeing them for who they really were. Two con artists who had used their family as a means to an end. This was the poetic justice I had been dreaming of. It was sweet, and it was cold. It was my final step. The whispers grew louder. Ethan and Anya tried to leave, but the room was too crowded. They were trapped. They were in a cage of their own making. They were surrounded by the people they had tried to impress, and they were all looking at them with disgust. They had no way out. The launch party, the one that was supposed to be a celebration of their success, was now a public reckoning. It was the most satisfying moment of my life. I had given them a public lesson. I had given them what they deserved. The humiliation was a permanent stain on their reputation. It was a wound that would never heal. As they finally managed to get to the door, a path clearing for them, Anya turned back, her eyes full of a cold, hard hatred. "You think you won?" she whispered. "I took your boy from you long before he stopped going to funerals. I was a man who had lost everything, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was a terrible step, a step that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But it was a step that had to be taken. I stood there for a long time after they left, the room a blur of motion and sound. The people in the room were now a cacophony of voices, a mix of pity and contempt. They were all talking about Ethan and Anya, about the lies, about the deceit, about the betrayal. I had given them a story that would be told for years to come. I had given them a reason to despise my son and his wife. I had given them a public lesson. I had given them what they deserved. I had a sense of closure, a sense of peace. I had done what I had to do. The humiliation was a permanent stain on their reputation. It was a wound that would never heal. The people in the room were now a part of my story, a story that I had written with my own hands. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was my final step. It was the step that would shake their world harder than any grave ever could. It was my final step. I left the party, a ghost in my own story. I walked out into the cold night, the autumn air a harsh reminder of everything I had lost. The silence of the night was a welcome change from the noise of the party. I walked home, the streets a blur of motion and light. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was a terrible step, a step that would haunt me for the rest of my life, but it was a step that had to be taken. I walked into my house, the cold and dark a welcome change from the noise and the light of the city. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was my final step. It was the step that would shake their world harder than any grave ever could. It was my final step. I sat in the darkness of my home, the only light coming from the streetlights outside. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was a terrible step, a step that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But it was a step that had to be taken. I walked into my house, the cold and dark a welcome change from the noise and the light of the city. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was my final step. It was the step that would shake their world harder than any grave ever could. It was my final step. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was a terrible step, a step that would haunt me for the rest of my life, but it was a step that had to be taken. I walked into my house, the cold and dark a welcome change from the noise and the light of the city. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was my final step. It was the step that would shake their world harder than any grave ever could. It was my final step. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son. But I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was my final step. It was the step that would shake their world harder than any grave ever could. It was my final step. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was my final step. It was the step that would shake their world harder than any grave ever could. It was my final step. I sat in the darkness of my home, the only light coming from the streetlights outside. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was a terrible step, a step that would haunt me for the rest of my life, but it was a step that had to be taken. I walked into my house, the cold and dark a welcome change from the noise and the light of the city. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son, but I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was my final step. It was the step that would shake their world harder than any grave ever could. It was my final step. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son. But I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was a terrible step, a step that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But it was a step that had to be taken. I walked into my house, the cold and dark a welcome change from the noise and the light of the city. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and his son. But I had a sense of satisfaction. I had done what I had to do. I had taken my last step. It was my final step. It was the step that would shake their world harder than any grave ever could. It was my final step. All was silent now. The chaos of the party, the frantic buzz of conversations, and the sharp clinking of glasses had all faded into a distant, ringing echo in my ears. The limousine I had taken was a silent, dark cocoon, gliding through city streets that smeared past the tinted windows in streaks of neon and gold. Now, the only sound was the heavy thud of the old oak door closing behind me, a sound of finality that echoed through the cavernous quiet of my home. I walked into the living room, the cool autumn air that seeped through the window frames a harsh reminder of everything I had lost. I didn't turn on a lamp. I sat in my armchair, the worn leather cool against my skin, and let the darkness of my home envelop me. The only light came from the streetlights outside, casting long, distorted shadows that turned familiar furniture into strange, looming shapes. This room was no longer a home, but a museum of a life that was over, its artifacts, the armchair she loved, the stack of books on her side table, the faint scent of lavender in the air, all speaking 1,000 unspoken words. I was a man alone in the world, a man who had lost his wife and tonight had surgically removed his son. Anya's words came back to me, not as a memory, but as a cruel, fresh whisper in the silent room. You think you won? I took your boy from you long before he stopped going to funerals. The words were a shard of ice in my gut, a bitter truth I had spent years refusing to face. I felt a hollowness spread through my chest, an ache different from grief. It was the ache of failure. The public humiliation at the party had not been a victory. It was the desperate final act of a man who understood he had already lost. On a bookshelf across the room, a small silver frame caught the streetlight. It was Ethan at 10, beaming, holding up a ridiculously small fish on a summer trip. My son was no longer the boy in that picture, the one who had loved his mother with a fierce, simple devotion. He was a stranger, a ghost shaped and molded by a woman who saw love not as a bond, but as a resource. Anya hadn't just taken him away from me. She had hollowed him out and stolen his soul. My feet carried me across the creaking floorboards to the mantelpiece, my fingers tracing the cool, smooth marble. I picked up a photograph of Rachel. It was from our anniversary, the light catching the silver in her hair, her eyes full of a quiet, knowing warmth that had been the center of my life for so long. She was smiling directly at me, a look of unwavering love that now felt like an indictment. I had to do this, Rachel, I thought, my throat tight. I had to draw the line. She had died, and I had been left to face the consequences of a rot that had set in long before she was gone. The step I took tonight was terrible, a step that cost me the last vestige of the boy in the silver frame, but it was a step that had to be taken. I had set a boundary made of ruin and shame. I had given my son and his wife exactly what they had earned. They would never forget the man who brought them down. I returned to the chair in the darkness, the silence no longer a void, but a comfort. It was the peace of a battlefield after the war was over, a desolate quiet where nothing is left to fight for. I was a man alone, having lost everything that mattered. But in that absolute loss, There was a sense of grim closure. The revenge was not sweet. It was not a victory. It was a necessary, terrible amputation. An act that will surely haunt the remainder of my days. But it was a step that had to be taken. A final, permanent severance. It was the step that would shake their gilded, hollow world harder than any grave ever could. Was it worth the cost of my son? If you had been in my place, would you have done the same? I would be honored to hear your reflections. Please feel free to leave a comment below.